Hello, welcome back to IASA's Virtual Leadership Series after our brief hiatus over the summer. As you'll probably be aware, we launched our IASA Exchange this year, and we have content for that now available on demand via IASA's e-learning center. And with summer, we felt like people had enough on their plates already and wanted to take a little bit of a break with this. But we're back, and our topic today is performance managing and measuring workloads. I'm Darin Reffit, the Group Director of Product Marketing Excellence with Guidewire Software, as well as the Chair of E-Learning for IASA. And we're here with the CEO of IASA, Kerry, Crockett, and Cathy Ellwood, the founder of Ellwood Enterprises. So we're heading into the fall, right? And it's time for us to start thinking about the dreaded performance review period. And even in a normal year, that can bring up a lot of stress, a little bit of consternation for people. And now we're living in a totally virtual world, an environment we've never really experienced before. So this is a big topic, I think, at this point. And so what we've agreed to do is we're going to break it into three pieces. We're going to talk today about the impacts of COVID-19 on our objectives. And then we're going to talk about leadership competencies in a virtual world, and finally measuring performance in a virtual world. So this one's a little bit different than previous. We'll be in a three-part series. So to kick off part one, Cathy, how do you think COVID-19 has impacted the ways we ought to be thinking about measuring performance?
That's a good question. I think, first of all, it really depends on how your organization does performance reviews in the first place. To me, it's like another shock to our management system. Something happened that totally disrupted everything that we were doing. But in this case, it disrupted everything that everybody was doing, and it has a dramatic effect on productivity. And I don't care if you had work from home or not. You know, the way, all the issues that have come up, all the factors that have come into play with regard to getting the job done, learning how to communicate effectively, learning how to be productive in a virtual world, none of that really was anticipated. So it's really shifted the way we ought to be thinking about performance management. And it's interesting, you know, I gave a presentation on this a few years ago, and I'd suggested that organizations ought to totally eliminate the traditional feared annual review. And part of that was because things were moving too fast. You know, and what's happened since then is a lot of organizations, they still do an annual review, but they also do a quarterly review. And it's an ongoing cycle, it's an ongoing process. The thing I think that COVID has made really different, though, is a lot of people were not used to working from home. And so it's really hard to manage productivity, how you spend your time. You know, it's really hard if you're a leader to observe productivity. There are upsides and there's downsides. And it's harder to gauge burnout, right? Because you can't see it. You can't see what a person is actually doing anymore. You know, so on the one hand, if you're evaluating people based on what you see, is it, you know, watching them in Zoom meetings, or is it focusing on the results that they had committed to delivering before? Now, the one thing I think is really key is that as a leader, we have to be sensitive to the fact that the objectives, all of our objectives have changed. And some organizations have made a conscious decision not to actually penalize somebody because of COVID. You know, they may make everybody even. You know, they may say, you know, you're not going to be penalized for what you didn't accomplish because of COVID.
I think that's an important point, Cathy. And I think in addition to that, we have to remember that we started this year with the wrong metrics for virtual work. The metrics that most of us were gauging success on were really developed for a different environment. It was really around an in-office setting where teams were constantly interacting face-to-face, and one that included, you know, the spontaneous collaboration that can often happen and has a strong impact on both that individual and the organizational performance as well. And I think in this new virtual era, you know, different competencies are going to have to be developed, and we're going to have to figure out the new ones that are going to work well in this virtual world. Some examples there, we're going to have to think about more independence, how we're going to give our team members more independence to do their jobs. which means there's going to be less oversight, obviously. So we're not there to see what happens day to day in that office and how they're working and how they're interacting with their team members. And then, of course, right now we have way more meetings and everybody is suffering from that Zoom fatigue. And so all of these things I think we're going to have to really consider as we're talking about different competencies needed in this virtual world.
Yeah, there are definitely way more meetings than there used to be. We were talking at work recently about the fact that between people not traveling as much and the fact that we don't have that in-person ability to, walk down the hallway and talk to someone, it's just making it way easier. There's also a statistic that I saw recently from, I think it was Harvard Business Review, that people are working longer hours, right? There's an additional 50 minutes of work. And part of that's probably driven by the meetings. Part of it is, that measure was of how long people were, online. Part of it could be the fact that, there's no commute. So people are logging in earlier in the day, or that they're taking more breaks because they have to work with their kids on their schoolwork. And that's all part of needing to be flexible in this environment, right? It seems that people just need to be more agile right now and work harder just to adapt to everything that's gone on this year. How do you think that should be considered?
Okay, so, I've been a leader in organizations all my life, practically, or it feels that way. I definitely think that we as leaders have to rethink what we expect of people and how we gauge their productivity and performance. Being agile is one thing, but it's really more about attitude. It's more about how does that individual cope with all the change that's been put on them. Now, organizations that were a lot more agile, that already modernized their technology and that have already gone to a digital platform, they're not struggling near as much as organizations that are still dealing with legacy systems and that don't have browser-based platforms. I mean, quite candidly, some of the organizations I know are doing a lot more, they're doing a lot better, but I think it's really key that we as leaders rethink what we expect of a person. For example, Kerry talked a little bit about competencies. And I think that, being agile is one thing, but being able to communicate effectively is another. And I think that there's a big drain on our ability to communicate effectively as leaders in the virtual environment. The final point I want to make on that particular topic is the burnout factor. You talked about more meetings. So who creates the meetings and who allows them to get put on the calendar, and who manages our individual time, and who is working overtime all the time? I mean, quite candidly, we have to take responsibility for our own level of stress and burnout. So yes, you need to be more agile, but that doesn't mean that you need to burn yourself out and risk ruining your health and family life at the cost of doing so.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more with what you just said, Cathy. It's true. We're all facing the same thing. I think, in addition, the virtual world really made some things more apparent than ever before. I think we're seeing that a lack of clear goals and accountability really can leave some team members floundering, and they're struggling in that environment. In an office setting, it's really easier to observe, and pick up clues from your teammates on the direction and the priorities that the organization is taking and what needs to be handled first. I think it's also easier for a lot of folks to ride the coattails of others. And so that's something that's not really done easily in a virtual environment, and you're able to really find those people very quickly. So that's something I think that we're thinking about as well. I think another thing that we're thinking about here is, the lack of aligned team goals. I mean, with some teams that are scattered, it's really easy for folks to lose their focus on what the small and the big picture is. And I think it's important to reiterate the incremental and those overarching goals of the team and the organization so that all of us can benefit and really realign our work to reach them. And then finally, ineffective governance and oversight is an issue. In a virtual environment, everything seems to be really under that microscope, and it's more so ever than before. And that can really divert a leader's attention away from that individual team member's performance. So I think it's really incumbent on leaders to ensure that, we're still dedicating that time to each team member to help them stay on track.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's really important stuff to consider. I do want to jump back to something Cathy said about the burnout and who's causing that. During one of our recent all hands meetings, our CEO, someone asked a question, and our all hands are very open. You can Slack a question to the CEO and it gets answered. And one of the questions was, what can we do about the number of meetings? And, we had a whole discussion about the fact that, people don't even have time for a bio break. You're literally scheduled up to the hour, and then the next hour is starting. And we're talking about the idea came up of, hey, should we have a limit on meetings to 50 minutes so people at least get a 10-minute break at the end? And one thing I was so impressed with our CEO, Mike Rosenbaum, was he made the comment, hey, this is one of those things that, my team was like, hey, why are you even worrying about this? Is this the kind of thing a CEO needs to think about? And he responded and said, this is exactly the kind of thing a CEO needs to think about. Because if I don't endorse it and make it happen, it can't happen across the company. And an initiative like that can't actually be effective unless everyone is embracing it from the top down. So I think that's a great way to look at it, is that, we need to be thinking about this all the way through the organization, not just in individual departments and individual instances. So top down is important, but I'm going to go to the other side of that now. What's the bottom line? Should managers be flexible in how they're evaluating people at year end? Should raises and bonuses be paid even if the company doesn't achieve its goals? How should our organizational leaders be thinking about this to balance out, yes, it's been a tough year, but it's also, we have teams to reward. We have people who have been struggling, and we've been struggling as well. How do you balance all that?
Yeah, it's really tough, to be honest. I mean, because, you have to remember a lot of us leaders, are not used to working in a virtual environment either. So we're having to gauge how we are evaluating our teams, et cetera. But I think there does need to be some flexibility, or you could really risk losing some really good people. And we certainly don't want to have that happen. And I think for those that are new to working remotely, this has been a huge upheaval to their norm. I mean, it's changing from working side by side with your teammates in an office setting to working alone. And that can dramatically change the dynamic of a team's performance, and ultimately that individual's performance. I think as it relates to things like, raises and bonuses and that sort of thing, I mean, you really have to consider the reality of it and what that financial performance of the business is at hand. I mean, if your business is struggling financially, it might be really difficult to justify raises and bonuses. I mean, at the end of the day, we have to make sure that we all still have a business to come to report to work too, right? We want to make sure we keep our jobs. And so there is that financial impact. But I think, there's some opportunities leaders can take here to reward individuals for a job well done. It doesn't have to be monetary. I mean, you can think about things like additional days off. You can think about company awards if you don't have an employee of the month, or those kinds of things. Or simply just words of appreciation and encouragement. I mean, they can go a long, long way. And I think that it's really incumbent on us as leaders to think about those kinds of things. And it's more important than ever to really keep the morale up of our teams. And I think, then when the financials are back on track and the business is on more solid footing, you can think about offering those monetary rewards at that time.
Well, you know what? One of the things that I found, and there's a lot of research on this, is that people in general are a lot more understanding with bad news when it's communicated and they perceive that you're being fair.
Yes.
So if the executives are still getting their bonuses, but everybody else in the company isn't, that's a problem. Mm-hmm. And if you don't think that the organization, that news is going to get out, it always does. So, from my perspective, yes, you need to be flexible, but everybody needs to be treated fairly. And if people perceive that you're treating everybody fairly, then they're much more willing to go along with what you're saying and to write it out. But the operative word here is communication, right? You've got to communicate exactly, what is going on, what your attitudes and beliefs are with respect to financial, results and performance. And you're also going to need to set expectations. It's not a time for people to slack. I mean, this is a time for people to rise up in their performance and to be the positive person and to encourage and bring others with them. It's definitely one where, you know, your best are going to shine, and the ones that were slackers, it's going to be worse for them ultimately.
Yeah.
I would be remiss as a marketer if I didn't point out that, you know, yeah, it's challenging as executives giving themselves bonuses and the employees not receiving them, creating some feeling of disparate treatment or unfairness in the workplace. But there's also the external optics on your brand, right? And we've seen this recently as companies are awarding bonuses to their executives and then filing bankruptcy 3 days later. And the optics of that from your brand and how you're going to live, you know, we also need to think beyond COVID, right? And think about the fact that what you're doing to your brand today is going to travel into the days where we return to hopefully something that's a little more normal. So there are so many other topics that we need to talk about around leadership competencies. And I think that's a really important part of this discussion. And that's the topic of our next session. So why don't we wrap it up here? And before we go, we'll just start with some final thoughts. Why don't we start with you, Kerry?
Sure. I think the big takeaway for me today in this conversation is really about allowing yourself to have some flexibility as a leader when you are really starting to evaluate your teammates and your employees that work for you. So, you know, thinking about the metrics that you started the year with in a different environment and how those are going to have to be adjusted for the new normal that we're in now in terms of working remotely. And so thinking those through and how you're going to have those conversations with your team members about, you know, adjusting those. And I think it's great to involve them in that process as well, so that they understand how you're thinking through how you're going to gauge them differently and measure their performance.
Great. Cathy?
So I've always heard executives talk about what they wish. They want their people to be more agile. They want their people to respond to change. They want them to be able to do more with less and to be able to get more done. Well, guess what? COVID has created an opportunity for everybody in the organization to be more agile, to respond to change. And so I want to say, if you're a leader, cut your people some slack, give them credit for what they've done, because they've risen to the challenge. And, you know, most of the organizations that I've talked to haven't missed a beat. I mean, there have been some issues, but they're still operating business as usual. And they're doing a lot of things that, you know, they never thought before were possible. And so, you know, embrace the change and recognize that it's going to keep happening.
Sounds like a plan. And just remember, the worst thing you can do is to have a meeting to figure out why people don't have enough time to get their jobs done. That's a little hint from me. Thank you again for joining us out there. We will be back next week when we jump into how leadership competencies are changing in a virtual world. Thanks so much and have a wonderful week.